coming up. Between 1939 and 1947, 8-year period, 4 tragic sea voyages impacted on Jewish history. I suspect that you'll all be familiar with one of the voyages, somewhat familiar with another of the voyages, possibly would have heard of the 3rd ship, and most of you will not have heard anything about the 4th ship. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, German Jews started frantically trying to seek refuge abroad, and hundreds of thousands indeed managed to do so in the years after 33. But by the end of the decade, it became much more difficult, not because the Nazi authorities didn't allow the Jews to leave, but of course because there was nowhere for them to go. No one was taking them in. Aaron Posner, a Hebrew teacher, was one of the 26,000 Jews arrested and sent to concentration camps on the evening of Kristallnacht, the pogrom of November the 9th, 1938. He was sent to Dachau, where he witnessed brutal murders by hanging, drowning and crucifixion, as well as torture by flogging and castrations by a bayonet. In early May 1939, Aaron was suddenly released from Dachau on condition that he left Germany within 14 days. Though his family had very little money, they pooled their resources to buy him a ticket aboard the SS St. Louis, a cruise liner that was sailing from Hamburg to Cuba on May the 13th, 1939, with 937 Jewish refugees aboard. Now, the passengers had all been issued with Cuban visas. That was how they were able to leave. Otherwise, if they didn't have a visa for somewhere, they couldn't have left. After years of being treated with contempt, the passengers aboard the St. Louis were now treated like privileged tourists by Captain Gustav Schroeder and his crew. There were dances, there were concerts. He allowed them to have Friday night services, and he even, in the dining room, and he even agreed to cover a bust of Hitler with a tablecloth. In the very same week that my then 15-year-old father and hundreds of other children in his kinder transport arrived in England, the St. Louis dropped anchor in Havana Harbor. A nasty surprise awaited the passengers. The Cuban government, headed by President Federico Laredo Bru, refused to accept the foreign refugees even though they'd purchased valid visas. A week earlier, while they were on the ship, Havana issued Decree number 937, whereby visas issued before May the 5th were invalidated retroactively. At a huge anti-Semitic rally in Havana, a former Cuban president urged Cubans to fight the Jews until the last one is driven out. And in the end, the Cuban government admitted only 28 passengers, 22 Jews with valid US visas, 2 Jews with Spanish citizenship, and 2 Jews with Cuban nationality. We know that 2 members of President Roosevelt's cabinet, Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Treasury Secretary, the Jewish Henry Morgenthau, tried to persuade Cuba to accept the refugees. Their actions, together with efforts of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint as it's called, ended in failure. And the remaining 915 Jewish passengers were not allowed to disembark. Captain Schroeder circled off the coast of Florida, hoping for permission to enter the United States. He even considered running aground along the coast to allow the refugees to escape, but he was shadowed by US Coast Guard vessels that fired a warning shot to keep the St. Louis away from Florida's shores. The ship was so close to Florida that the passengers could see the lights of Miami. Some passengers on the St. Louis cabled Roosevelt, asking for refuge. He never responded. A State Department telegram sent to one passenger stated that the passengers must, and I quote, await their turns on the waiting list and qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they may be admissible into the United States. Aaron Posner and several Jewish young men stormed the bridge and overpowered the watch in a mutiny attempt. They demanded that Captain Schroeder sail to any country other than Germany. After persuading the young men to desist from laying themselves open to a charge of piracy, the captain promised to do all he could not to return the passengers to Germany. True to his word, the captain docked the St. Louis in Antwerp on June the 17th, 1939. Britain agreed to take 288 of the passengers, and after much negotiation by Schroeder, the remaining 619 passengers were allowed to disembark in Antwerp. 224 were accepted by France, 214 by Belgium, and 181 by the Netherlands. Aaron Posner was one of the lucky ones to survive the Holocaust. It is estimated that over 250 of the St. Louis Jewish refugees were swallowed up in the Holocaust after the Nazis overran France, Belgium, and Holland. And in 1993, Captain Schroeder was posthumously named as one of the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. After the fall of France in 1940, the British government responded to public panic over the enemy within and temporarily interned thousands of foreign nationals. And although Prime Minister Winston Churchill later described the internment of Jews as a deplorable and regrettable mistake, it was too late for thousands of Jewish males aged 16 to 60. Earlier I mentioned my father's escape to Britain. Well, several of his teachers at his refugee farm school in Scotland were also arrested and interned. Frankfurt-born Rabbi Asher Feuchtwanger was a member of an illustrious family. A gifted student who had studied in some of the world's greatest yeshivot, he arrived as a refugee in Britain in the 30s. After World War II, he was my communal rabbi and mentor in the small Jewish community where I grew up in England. Between his arrival in England before the war and becoming my communal rabbi after the war, Rabbi Feuchtwanger visited Australia. Not, I should add, because he had an urge to explore Oz. This mild-mannered rabbi visited Australia because the British government suspected him of being a Nazi sympathizer. He found himself aboard a ship which lent her name to one of the more notorious events of British maritime history. On June the 10th, 1940, together with over 500 German Nazis and Italian fascists, 2,000 Jewish internees boarded the HMT, that's hired military transport ship, Dunera. With 7 officers and a crew of 309 poorly trained soldiers, nearly 3,000 men were crammed onto a vessel built to hold 1,600. The ship's crew brutally searched and looted the Jewish internees' luggage. In scenes reminiscent of the worst excesses of the Nazis, prayer shawls, phylacteries, tefillin, and prayer books were tossed into the sea. This is British soldiers, I want to remind you. The ship's commanders, Lieutenant Colonel William Scott and First Lieutenant O'Neill, either stood by indifferently or actively participated. When the ship left Liverpool at midnight, it had only one destroyer escort, and this is despite the fact that just a week earlier, another ship carrying internees, the Andorra Star, taking refugees to Canada, was sunk by a German torpedo. An uncle of mine was meant to be on the Andorra Star, and at the last minute, they didn't board him, and he stayed on the Isle of Man. Sure enough, less than 24 hours out of Liverpool, a German submarine torpedo hit the Dunera, but failed to explode. A second torpedo miraculously passed underneath the ship as it rose in choppy waters. The 57 days of the voyage were a nightmare of inhuman conditions and brutal mistreatment. The lower decks of the ship were jammed and men had to sleep on mess tables or on the floor. For weeks, hatches were kept down. Neither daylight nor natural air ever reached the decks. Sentries with bayonets made sure that the upper parts of the ship were out of bounds. Only 10 toilets were available for 3,000 men, which meant long queues and toilet police who would call up people as vacancies arose. When the former chief rabbi of Munich, one of the internees, lodged an official complaint to the captain, the latter threatened to hang him from the mast. With their luggage stolen, the refugees had just the clothes on their backs, and most of them were without toothbrushes, toothpaste, combs, or soap. There was only one doctor on board. The crew treated the refugees with extreme cruelty and did not even inform them of their true destination until some of the smart internees worked it out from the stars and realized that they were going to Australia. The crew searched the men daily, and if guards found any vital medications, such as insulin, they threw them overboard. They also threw away false teeth. They confiscated razors and shaving utensils and threatened men who hid their razors or who were clean-shaven with detention in the bunker. Any valuables or hidden food were confiscated. There were beatings on a daily basis, and despite the horrific conditions on the ship, many internees were able to preserve some semblance of intellectual life on board. Debates and lectures were held on a wide range of subjects: music, economics, literature, language, geography and agriculture. And Rabbi Feuchtwanger's daughter told me that when her father was not mediating between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jewish passengers, which he did a lot of, he spent most of his time quietly studying. Prior to arrival in Australia, the crew ordered the internees to shave off their beards, providing the 2,540 men with 8 razors. That's 300 people per razor to do the task. The non-Jewish Germans and Italians disembarked in Melbourne on September the 3rd, 1940, and on the morning of September the 6th, 57 days out of Liverpool, the Dunera entered Sydney Harbour. When Captain Scott wrote his report at the end of the voyage, he wrote, "The Nazi Germans' behaviour was exemplary. They are a fine type, honest and straightforward and extremely well disciplined. The Jews can only be described as subversive liars, demanding and arrogant, not to be trusted by deed or word." Australian medical officer, army officer, Alan Frost, was so appalled at what he saw on board when he was the first person to actually go on board, he wrote a report that was the basis for Scott's court-martial, and he was found guilty. Charges were also laid against a number of the Dunera guards, and compensation payments were allocated to the deportees. The maltreatment of prisoners by some of the British escort troops earned the Dunera the label Hell Ship. Rabbi Feuchtwanger was one of the lucky passengers to be taken to Palestine relatively soon after he arrived in Australia. Others stayed in internee camps in Australia for the rest of the war. David Stoliar was sent by the Romanian authorities to a forced labour camp in 1940. He later served in the British Army, fought in the Israeli Defence Force during the War of Independence, worked in Japan, and moved to the USA, where he died last year, aged 91. I mention David's name because he was the sole survivor of the Struma. Built in 1867 as a luxury steam yacht and used more recently as a livestock ferry, the Struma was purchased in 1942 by the new revisionist Zionist party in Romania to ferry a group of immigrants to British-mandated Palestine. The ship was in a miserable technical condition, made even worse after an unreliable engine was installed. And despite Romania's active participation in the Holocaust, Antonescu's fascist government turned a blind eye to this rescue operation, and it emerged in the 1961 Eichmann trial that it was the Romanian secret police that allowed the Jews to leave. The Jews planned to reach Istanbul in neutral Turkey, where they hoped to be given permission to make their way by land to Palestine. A group of 300 Romanian Jews registered for the trip, but the numbers swelled when news filtered into Romania of the killing of Jews in Poland and the Soviet Union. December 1941, a group of 769 Jewish men, women, children and babies boarded the 16-meter by 6-meter rickety Struma in the Romanian port of Constanța, together with the crew and a group of 60 Beitar youth. Beitar is the youth organization of the revisionist Zionist Party. The passengers paid large fees to board the ship. David Stoliar's father managed to get him released from a labor camp and bribed Romanian officials to issue him with a passport. Each refugee was allowed to take 20 kilograms of luggage, but surprise, surprise, and possibly learning from the example of the British troops on board the Dunărea, Romanian customs officers stole many of the refugees' valuables and other possessions, along with any food they had brought with them. The Struma had only 2 lifeboats. Below decks, passengers had to sleep 4 abreast with 60 centimeters width per person. On December the 11th, 1941, a Romanian Coast Guard tug led the Struma clear of the minefield that surrounded the port. The Struma drifted overnight while her crew tried valiantly to start her engine. She transmitted distress signals, and on the 13th of December, the Romanian Coast Guards returned, demanding payment if they were to repair Struma's engine. The refugees had no money after buying their tickets, so they gave all their wedding rings to the Coast Guards, who then repaired the engine. Struma got underway again, but by 15th of December, her engine had failed again. The boat was without fuel, food, or water. A Turkish tugboat towed the Struma into Istanbul harbour, but afraid of jeopardizing their neutrality, the Turkish authorities refused to allow the Jews to disembark. And despite help provided by the Jewish community of Istanbul, the passengers suffered from cold, filth and hunger. Meanwhile, frantic negotiations were taking place between the Jewish Agency and the Joint, with the Turkish and British governments, that were resolved not to allow the Jews into Turkey or to Palestine. Only 9 passengers were allowed to disembark on medical grounds or because they held valid entry visas for Palestine. No one else left the crippled boat, where the hundreds of passengers were imprisoned in narrow, unventilated confines, taking turns to climb up for a breath of fresh air. There was not enough sleeping space for all, no infirmary, no galley, no bathing facilities, and just one single makeshift toilet. The British pressured the Turks to return the ship to Romania in order to block any further immigration from the Balkans. This is in the middle of the war, just to remind you. Britain's High Commissioner in Palestine, Harold McMichael, only agreed that children aged 11 to 16 on the ship would be given Palestinian visas. But then Britain and Turkey started haggling over the children's transportation to Palestine. Britain declined to send a ship, while Turkey refused to allow them to travel overland. On February the 23rd, 1942, with the issue still unresolved, Turkey took brave unilateral action. By now, the floating death trap had spent 10 miserable weeks in Istanbul's harbour. With the Struma's engine still inoperable, a small party of Turkish police tried to board her. The refugees would not let them on board. Then a larger force of about 80 police came, surrounded the Struma with motorboats, and after about half an hour of resistance, boarded the ship. The police detached Struma's anchor, and attached her to a tug, which towed her through the Bosphorus and out into the Black Sea. Many passengers hung signs over the sides that read, "Save us," in Hebrew and English. And although the engine would still not start, the Turkish authorities abandoned the ship in the Black Sea about 10 miles north of the Bosphorus. After drifting helplessly for several hours, the ship was rocked by a huge explosion in the early hours of February the 24th. David Stoliar describes what happened. "It was probably 3 or 4 in the morning. I woke up as I was thrown into the air. I fell back into the water, and when I surfaced, there was no vessel anymore. Nothing. Just debris." Now, when I first started giving talks and mentioning the Struma, that was about 10 years ago, the cause of the explosion was still a mystery, with several conspiracy theories and explanations being offered in the literature. It was only recently been established conclusively that the Struma was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. Among those who died in the explosion was Stoliar's fiancée Ilse and her parents, who'd been sleeping in the bottom part of the ship's hull. Many passengers actually survived the sinking and clung to pieces of wreckage, but for hours no rescue came. One after another, they froze to death and slipped into the abyss. Eventually, says Stoliar, I was just by myself. He was the sole survivor. He clung to a floating piece of deck and was picked up by a Turkish Coast Guard rowboat 24 hours later. He was taken to a military hospital in Istanbul, and then, in a brilliant Kafkaesque touch, he was kept in jail for 71 days for entering Turkey illegally. Eventually, the British government decided to grant an exception, and they allowed him to enter Palestine. Wow. The sinking of the Struma caused a storm of protests and anger among Palestine's Jewish community. The Irgun underground militia published a wanted for murder poster with a picture of Michael on it. On the 9th of June 1942, Lord Wedgwood said in the House of Lords, "I hope yet to live to see those who sent the Struma cargo back to the Nazis hung as high as Haman, cheek by jowl with their prototype and Führer, Adolf Hitler." That's a very strong statement. British soldier and Anglo-Jewish poet Emanuel Litvinov wrote a scathing poem mourning the loss and betrayal of the Struma, and he said, "I now call the British khaki I wear a badge of shame." The 71-day saga of the Struma dramatically displayed the utter helplessness, humiliation, and powerlessness of Jews during the Holocaust. And the sinking of the Struma is regarded as the greatest maritime disaster of World War II, involving only civilian casualties. In the months and years immediately after the end of World War II, the British maintained their policy of preventing Jews who had survived the carnage of Europe from reaching the Jewish homeland. Finally, in February 1947, Britain returned its mandate to the United Nations, stating that the mandate had become unworkable. The United Nations General Assembly established UNSCOP, that's the United Nations Special Committee in Palestine, to recommend whether Palestine should be partitioned into a Jewish and an Arab state. In order to sway the opinions of the UNSCOP members, the Haganah, the Jewish underground army in Palestine, planned to highlight the iniquity of British policy by breaking the British blockade. In 1946, the Haganah had purchased a small paddle steamer called President Warfield. One of the crew members was a Presbyterian minister by the name of Reverend John Stanley Growell. His mother taught her children that anyone on the side of the Jews would survive any of life's challenges because the Jews were God's chosen people. Growell had been very distressed by images of Nazi thugs standing over old Jews scrubbing the streets. And he writes, while suffering this abuse and other indignities, the Jews were wearing their iron crosses won in defense of Germany during World War I. Growl became executive director of the Philadelphia office of the American Christian Palestine Committee, which was, of course, a pro-Jewish organization. The Haggadah had a very special reason for wanting Reverend Growl on board the ship. They knew that the word of a non-Jew would be believed more than the word of a Jew. Under the guise of a reporter for an obscure church magazine, Growl obtained press credentials that allowed him to enter Palestine legally. He joined the warfield in Baltimore Harbor. I quote, about a week before we did sail, a ceremony took place on board. The crew and some important guests gathered as the crew took the Haggadah oath. We were each given a sweater and a Bible, Old Testament for everyone else, New Testament for me, which I regarded as very thoughtful. The warfield left Baltimore on February the 25th, 1947, and sailed first to Marseille and then to Porto Venere in Italy. As Growl writes, the British authorities in Rome had taken steps in cooperation with the Italian authorities to prevent the sailing of the warfield, telling the local media that it was going to be used to transport, and I quote, escaping criminals and fascists. He continues, I was enraged to the point of tears many times by the lying statements of British officialdom in their undeclared war against the world's dispossessed. After being prevented from leaving for some weeks by the Italian Navy, the warfield sailed into Port de Bouc in France on July the 9th, 1947, where 172 trucks were waiting with 4,515 people, 1,600 men, 1,282 women, and 1,672 children and teenagers. And this is Growl. We had moored a large barge alongside the ship so that it would be possible for them to climb the side ladder to board. A little girl started climbing up the ladder onto the side of the ship. It would have been hard to distinguish her from any other girl her age, but I reached for her left elbow, and there on her arm I could see the number, the mark of the concentration camp. The ship's primitive sanitary facilities were soon overwhelmed by passengers suffering from seasickness, dehydration, and diarrhea. Of the 1,282 women, 400 were pregnant. And at dawn on the second morning, the loudspeaker announced, our first child has been born, mother and child are in excellent health. On July the 17th, 1947, as the warfield sailed off the Sinai coast, she was officially given her new name, the Exodus. The Haganah and the Zionist leadership has deliberately timed this huge illegal operation to coincide with the presence in Palestine of members of UNSCOP, the United Nations Committee. On the night of July the 18th, while the Exodus was in international waters 20 nautical miles off the coast of Gaza, British destroyers illegally rammed the defenseless ship. Everyone was thrown to the deck, tear gas grenades were flying and exploding, British sailors boarded the Exodus, clubbing everyone in sight and attacking with guns, stun grenades and bludgeons. Growl went into the chart room where he was confronted by a British sailor wearing a gas mask. Growl yelled, I'm an American correspondent, I must get into the captain's cabin. There's a man seriously injured in there. The sailor responded by swinging his club at Growl, yelling, get out or I'll kill you. When the sailor threatened Growl with his pistol, Growl made his getaway. The deck of the Exodus was littered with wounded and dead. First mate William Bernstein, a US sailor from San Francisco, was bludgeoned to death in the wheelhouse. 2 young refugee passengers were murdered, one was shot in the head. A 15-year-old boy, the last survivor of the Yakubovich family from the Holocaust, was shot in the stomach and killed. At least 150 refugees and crew members were injured, many severely. With water beginning to pour in the holes in the walls, the Haganah leaders were worried that the ship would capsize with huge loss of life. And they agreed to be towed into Haifa. When the thousands of refugee passengers caught their first glimpse of Palestine, they spontaneously lined the decks and sang Hatikva, the Zionist anthem. When the Exodus docked, Growl noticed a stretcher being carried towards a tent at the end of the wharf. On the stretcher was the body of young Hirsch Yakobovich, who had been shot dead in the stomach 6 hours earlier. The blanket was down around his waist, so it would appear as though he was still alive. Growl yelled, "This is the most goddamn despicable trick I've ever seen pulled." His anger and agitation succeeded in drawing British attention to him, which was the plan. He was removed from the ship, interrogated in Haifa police headquarters, placed under house arrest, and sent to Haifa's Savoy Hotel, accompanied by 2 armed guards. As planned, his cover as an American correspondent had succeeded in getting him off the ship. At the Savoy, the desk clerk informed Growl that the bar was full of newspaper reporters. Before the police escort could stop him, he dove through the door of the bar, loudly announcing that he was from the Exodus and would answer questions. Flashballs began to pop, and he was hemmed in all around by reporters as he gave them the first eyewitness report of what had really happened. At some point, one reporter edged in closer to Growl and whispered the Haganah code word for that day. The reporter told Growl to make his way to the men's room while the police were back in the doorway. 2 Haganah operatives rushed Growl out the back door and into a waiting American press car. Growl crouched down in the back of the press car as the vehicle sped away. Teddy Kollek and the Haganah had engineered Growl's escape so he could fulfill his meticulously planned role. He was taken on a harrowing road to Jerusalem, where he gave an impromptu press conference at the Eden Hotel. He was then spirited away to the apartment of Guatemala's UNSCOP delegate, Jorge Garcia Granados, who later described what happened. "I was at home when the doorbell rang. 2 American journalists stood at the entrance, accompanied by a stranger, tall and blonde in his 30s, with blue eyes, who appeared to be tense and anxious, wearing clothes that were obviously borrowed from someone else since they were not his size. I would like to introduce the Reverend John Growl of Worcester, Massachusetts," said one of the journalists, as he propelled the pastor inside and closed the door behind him. This is still Garcia Granados speaking. "He was a volunteer on the Exodus," continued the journalist, "and we've rushed him here from Haifa. The British have been trying to jail him. We would like you to hear his account before he places himself under the protection of the American consulate." So the next morning, Growl met UNSCOP members and gave them a full account of the battle, emphasizing the fact that the Jews had no weapons. Growl made one closing statement. "I have watched these people. I know what they are, and I tell you, the Jews in the European displaced persons camps insist on coming to Palestine. They will come to Palestine, and nothing short of open warfare and complete destruction will halt them." The Haganah strategy of placing Growl on the Exodus had paid off. After giving his testimony to the UNSCOP delegates, Growl was taken to an apartment house in Jerusalem, told to go up to the 2nd floor and knock on the door. This is Growl speaking. "I did as I was told, and Golda Meir answered the door. It was her apartment, and a meeting was being held there of the Jewish Agency." He says as well that if the British had known how many of the Jewish leadership were in Golda's apartment, they could have, decapitated the leadership. "They asked me for a full detailed report of the Exodus trip from beginning to end, and when I was finished, Golda was in tears." Growl stayed a few more days in Jerusalem, and after more hassles from the British authorities, he finally left on an American ship for New York, where a large contingent of the press corps awaited him, eager for his story. The New York Times reported, "Crewman from Exodus 1947 denies the British met firearms. Growl on arrival in New York says naval boarding party shot at Jews whose weapons were potatoes and canned goods." Meanwhile, the British transferred the Exodus passengers to 3 deportation ships which left for Port de Bouc, where the Jews refused to disembark. After 3 weeks, during which the prisoners on the ships rejected offers of alternative destinations, the ships sailed to Hamburg, Germany, then in the British occupation zone. The Jews were sent to DP camps. The irony of this situation seems to have been lost on the British. Jews who had escaped being murdered by the Nazis were now back on German soil. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we met Aaron Posner, a passenger aboard the St. Louis, Rabbi Asher Feuchtwanger, a passenger aboard the Dunera, David Stoliar, a passenger aboard the Struma, and Reverend John Growl, a crew member aboard the Exodus. And this is the point where I planned to end my talk. But in recent days, I learnt about the death ships. In the dying days of the war, late April and early May 1945, the Germans were still obsessed with Jews. The Germans loaded 3,000 Jewish women who still remained alive in the Stutthof concentration camp near Gdansk on the Baltic Sea, and loaded them onto 2 barges, the Wolfgang and the Vaterland, and sailed to Neustadt in Lübeck Bay. The SS shot more than 200 Jewish women, and German sailors shot a further 300 women. The rest of the women boarded the Aten, that's Athens, which together with the Thielbeck and the Cap Arcona were waiting to collect thousands of Jews from the Neuengamme concentration camp. On the Cap Arcona alone, there were 4,300 prisoners, 400 guards, and 100 crew members. The overcrowded and totally non-maneuverable ship had neither drinking water nor food for the prisoners. Dead bodies were piled up on the deck. And although the Swiss and the Swedish Red Cross societies informed the Allies of the embarkation of concentration camp prisoners scheduled for the 2nd and 3rd of May, RAF pilots did not get the message, and both ships were bombed as they drifted 3 kilometers offshore. The Cap Arcona burst into flames. Jewish prisoners jumped into the cold sea, but their weakened state ensured that most of them died. Both the Cap Arcona and the Thielbeck capsized, but could not sink to the bottom as the sea was too shallow, and with the ships listing badly, the SS men fired at the survivors in the sea. It is estimated that only about 600 of the 7,000 concentration camp prisoners on board the death ships survived. To conclude, of the 4 ships in the title of my talk this evening, only the Dunera, which was given the name Hell Ship by the Jews who sailed on her, successfully reached its destination. The St. Louis, which I would term the swindled ship, returned to its German point, it returned to Europe, and hundreds of its passengers later perished in the Holocaust. The Struma, which I would term the doomed ship, blew up with almost total loss of life, and the passengers aboard the Exodus, which I would call the propaganda ship, found themselves back on hated German soil. Thank you very much.